called The Age of the Western Hemisphere. This is from the mid 1800s. Evidence that it was inhabited by man before the flood. Now, I've covered material like this ad nauseum, but you'll see the relation and why I'm kind of starting out with this. A course of lectures on Egypt and the Egyptian is being delivered in one of the churches in Chicago. The minister has evidently made a long and careful study of the subject, and his object is to prove the authenticity of the Word of God by the results of recent archaeological research in Egypt and Palestine. Now, as we get farther up the Mississippi, we're going to make a whole lot of really interesting correlations to, America and Egypt, and why those words are synonymous, and why, again, following through the whole Anomalous America series. And for those that are new and haven't seen any, um, please go back and you just pick one. And, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, the amount of Egyptian overlays that we find, um, that I find and cover is pretty crazy. And, but yeah, so America as Egypt. And as we get closer to Missouri and Tennessee, and there's some interesting stuff we'll cover in Arkansas as well. It's going to get really, really crazy. Referring to the examination of images and bas reliefs in Egypt, he recently called attention to the extreme age of these works of man. Many of them are the sculptured images of the Ramses, the first kings of Egypt. Um, as we get farther, or closer, I suppose, as we move along the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to cover a book called King Ramses, the Father of America. It's a book written by an author from the 70s or 80s, I can't remember which. And he shows the iconography between some of the Indians of Florida being an identical match with that of King Ramses. And he postulates that King Ramses King Ramses III's reign was actually here in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, if you have seen my video on Queen Mu, it's a member series video, but it's available to everybody now. I strongly recommend checking out my Queen Mu video. There's a lot of overlays there, and it's going to connect a lot of dots between the Yucatan, the Gulf of Mexico, and why this region was Egypt, or was called Egypt, or known as Egypt, prior to some kind of cataclysm and a huge migration of people um, towards the Mediterranean. But anyways, back to the article. But the remarkable fact connected with these researchers is that although many of these monuments have been unearthed and the ancient hieroglyphics contained on them have been deciphered, not one has been found which will disprove a biblical statement. But on the contrary, many of them verify the historical statements of the Bible. The estimated age of the oldest of these sculptured stones is 44,000 to 5,000 years. Now, again, why the Anomalous America series has been so fantastic is we have, such a depth of material that really shows um, the dates and at least the historical narrative. Now, in my Colorado episode, we talked about one of the governors of Colorado who was pleading for help from the U.S. government because the Smithsonian was, not only were they tearing down ancient buildings, not only were they stealing priceless relics, weapons, all kinds of stuff, they were also stealing mummies and they were shipping them to Europe. Now, again, referencing Cudi Mayo's work, and we've done like a 6-part series together now. And, behind the scenes, we've discussed this quite often, but it seems very likely that much of the historical narrative of Europe, and at least the Nile Valley, has been kind of prostituted by relics from America. And that a lot of the oldest mummies, in fact, the majority of them, come from America, Mexico, and South America. Now, again, we've found mummies from Alaska, and I don't have any good mummy stuff for Mississippi. I'm sure they existed, but I don't have any in my archive. We're going to cover some in Arkansas, and we're going to get into a bunch in Tennessee and Missouri. So going to keep that kind of clock rolling with the whole mummy narrative. But why this is important is that, again, a lot of what they were using to identify, time frames and historical narrative stuff more than likely was stolen from the American Southwest and shipped to Egypt. So that was what even a governor of Colorado was claiming in the 1800s, pleading for help. These people are, you know, falsely attributing these historical places and shipping everything to Europe. Although this period of time appears to be remarkably long, it constitutes but 1/20th of the age of the remains of man recently found in the United States. So yeah, kind of a spoke before that great sentence there, but yeah, so 4 to 5,000 years is 1/20th the age of man recently found in the United States. Now, if you'll remember, um, Tigrinus, Emperor Tigrinus, the first Tesian mummy they believe ever, or the oldest, my apologies, was found in New Mexico. And they went as far as to say that they were the remnants of Atlantis post some kind of event. The continent of America is often designated by the appellation of the New World. But the researches of modern geologists and archaeologists have shown that the evidences in favor of high antiquity during our geological epoch, as well as our fauna and flora, are, to say the least, as great on this as on the Eastern Hemisphere. Again, kind of why I wanted to start out with this, because it's going to correlate a lot with what we've already been showing, that the megafauna, megaflora, and the tropical sort of vapor canopy age that existed all over America and is shown quite clearly in the fossil record here in America. And what went along with that? Well, giant men and giant reptiles, mammals that we've shown pretty much in almost every episode. Professor Agassiz, whose authority will hardly be questioned in matters of this kind, tells us that geology finds its oldest landmarks here. And Sir Charles Lyell, the noted geologist, from a mass of well digested facts and from the corroborating testimony of good authorities, includes that the Mississippi River has been running in its bed for more than 100,000 years. The authorities in support of the extreme age of the geological era to which man belongs, though startling to the unscientific, are not simply the opinions of a few, but are substantially adopted by the leading geologists everywhere. Now, again, this is kind of why I've fallen in love with the newspapers over the years. Is you can see a much more authentic, evidence-driven um, kind of positioning by these so-called authorities or you know academics, and that changes a lot, especially by not about 1920, 1930. It's like if you're not university backed, you're speaking as a university, not as an individual, and your work doesn't speak for itself anymore. It's kind of your credentials, and that's kind of where we're at today. But in the 1800s, it's these you had hundreds of men dedicating their entire lives, living, sleeping, breathing this stuff, and creating quite substantial amounts of evidence. I don't want to say proof, but good evidence. And the Mississippi is been the obsession of countless writers, from the 1700s all the way up until the early 1900s. I'm sure even longer, but with the kind of authenticity that has disappeared. Although antiquity so extreme for man's existence on Earth may shock some preconceived opinions, new facts have familiarized the minds of the scientific world to this conviction. The monuments of Egypt have carried us far beyond all chronologies heretofore adopted. And when these barriers are once overleaped, it is vain for us to attempt to approximate. The plain on which the city of New Orleans is built rises but 9 feet above the level of the sea. Now, we talked about this a little bit, and the same is true for a lot of the Gulf states in general. The amount of levee, um, canal work, and it's prehistoric. It existed before the quote Indians that are there today. When we get to Florida, we're really going to show this. We're going to show that there are canals there that are so ancient and so massive, and the bottoms of these canals are lined with some of the most huge, gigantic ancient trees. What came first? How could a canal come second to a huge, giant, petrified ancient tree? And the size of ships that some of these canals were designed for is mind boggling. It's the same with the steamship era. Even some of these companies that were building steamships for the Mississippi were using, as they stated, um, the ancient um, thoroughfare, the ancient canal works. That will require dredging um, beyond imagination. It's the same kind of overlay that I wanted to cover with the New Orleans. If you haven't seen that episode, go back. We kind of go over that a little bit, and we're going to talk about that more here. Rises 9 feet above the level of the sea. The excavations are often made far below the level of the Gulf of Mexico. In digging for the foundations of gas works, the Irish spadesmen, finding they had cut through timber instead of soil, gave up the work and were replaced by a corps of Kentucky axemen. So think about this, you guys. They're building levees and excavations, right? Strengthening them, digging down in the ground, and they find a standing forest. Okay. So the spadesmen, men with shovels, give up and they bring in a corps of Kentucky axemen. So they literally uncover a standing forest who hewed their way down through 4 successive growths of timber, the lowest so old that it cut like cheese. Abrasions of the riverbank show similar growths of sunken timber, while stately live oaks flourish on the banks directly above them and are living witnesses that the soil has not changed its level for ages. And then once we get farther up the Mississippi and we talk about the New Madrid event, we're going to see that we're dealing with successive events, as we've been showing several times now in many of my episodes, that we're dealing with civilizations built on other civilizations. And the Mississippi is showing us the same thing very clearly. Messer Dickinson and Brown have traced no less than 10 distinct cypress forests at different levels below the present surface in parts of Louisiana. Now, this continues all the way up the Mississippi. So this is why we're, again, covering this here, because it's the same thing on the Mississippi. It goes all the way up, in the middle of America. Where the range between high and low water is much greater than it is in New Orleans. These groups of trees, the live oaks on the bank and the successive cypress beds beneath, are arranged vertically. Really important. Okay. So we're not dealing with like one big event. We're dealing with like several layerings. And we're not just like talking about these thin little layers that geologists in different parts, especially where I'm from, I was really big into geology as a child and quite obsessive with rocks and thunder eggs. And I spent a lot of time as a kid digging for thunder eggs and all kinds of different quartz and crystals. And, the geologists would explain these different layerings, right? These different layerings and the ages and geological epochs that went into these layerings and how absolutely nonsense that was. And here we are, we're dealing with 10 vertical layers where the top 4 are 3 were solid. And just, I mean, just the imagery here in this article is part of what I love so much. Just imagine, you got these basically Irish slaves working for pennies on the dollar, digging down through the mud, and then they're hitting trees, and then they have to hire another company of lumbermen who chop down three more layers. In the fourth layer, the trees are still vertical, but they're like cheese, and they in some places go down as far as 10 levels of successive forest. So this is the largest layering event that I've ever been able to find. Now, does this mean that there's been 10 different events? I don't know for sure. But as we've shown pretty much from Alaska all the way to now in Mississippi, there's been at least four significant events, at least four, that have buried not only forests, but civilizations. And as we move up the Mississippi, we're going to show one or two layers of city infrastructure that exists. Where was I? My apologies. Calculations have been made by Dr. Bennett Dowler of the time of growth of each era of flora as found. Cypresses 10 feet in diameter are not uncommon in the swamps of Louisiana, and one of that kind was found standing vertically in the lowest bed of the excavation at the gasworks. Okay, so now if for those that have seen a bit of my work, you'll be familiar with my radium series where I've started to talk about gas, make gas, natural gas. I also work oil into this whole narrative, the oil industry, the natural gas industry, and its relation to radium and why this is important. Um, And these oil and gas companies, coal companies are finding insane stuff when they first start excavating and doing their drilling. And this is a perfect example. The estimated age of such a tree with 95 to 120 rings of annual growth to 1 inch is 5,700 years. So they found a standing cypress tree in the lowest bed. So we're dealing with some serious time frames here. Now, what's important to remember is that you can date a cypress fairly easily. However, due to climate, rings do develop faster. So these dates could be off slightly, but still, we're dealing with 10. That's what I want to focus on, not necessarily the ring, but the levels of buried, rebuilt. I mean, think about this. A buried forest, and then enough time for another forest to grow, and then a buried forest, and then time for another forest to grow. It's crazy. When I first read this article, I read it probably like 4 or 5 times. Like I just had the hardest time wrapping my mind around it. The calculation to avoid all ground of Seville was only made for 2 consecutive growths of these trees. So they were even actually they retarded their generalization just because they were dealing with such a substantial amount of time. As the age of the two generations, 11,400 years, and the excavation at the gasworks above referred to burnt wood was found at a depth of 16 feet. And at the same depth, the workmen discovered the skeleton of a man. The cranium lay beneath the roots of a cypress belonging to the fourth forest level below the surface and was in a good state of preservation. The other bones crumbled to pieces on being handled. The type of cranium was, as might have been expected, that of the Aboriginal American race. Now, that's a slippery slope because as we get farther up the Mississippi, we're going to show that there were probably as many as 5 or 6 different types of brain skulls found in the mounds in America. So that's kind of put an asterisk on that term, but very interesting nonetheless because we're dealing again with a burial beneath a cypress tree, and this was very common. It was common to bury people and and plant a cypress tree on top of their burial. I've covered this with Dr. Longo several times. There was a cypress tree that fell in Florida, and they found 600 bodies, skeletons, below one of these giant cypresses. So this is they've been doing this for a very long time. If we take then the present era at the calculated age of 14,400 years and add 43,200 for the three subterranean groups, again, these numbers, take them with a grain of salt, but still you have to wrap your mind around that we're dealing with a forest, with 100-foot trees, then another forest, and then another one, and then another one. Each group to the living, we have a total of 57,600 years. From these data, it appears that the human race existed in the delta of the Mississippi more than 57,000 years ago. And the 10 subterranean forests discovered, with the one now growing, established the fact that an exuberant flora existed in Louisiana more than 100,000 years earlier. So that 150,000 years ago, the Mississippi laved the magnificent cypress forest with its turbid waters. What then is the significance of a mummy or monument found in Egypt 4,000 years ago when compared with the actual skeleton of a man buried over 57,000 years ago in our native country? So, yeah, thanks for bearing with me through that. That was, kind of a long one, but I hope you see why I chose that as my introductory article. Really important because, again, it just further goes along with establishing not only a much deeper epoch here in America, especially American Southwest into the Gulf, but also showing, kind of the full circle again narrative that I was describing, that, although Egypt is full of mystery and many amazing things, the time frames and at least from a historical perspective, have been quite manipulated, and that's exactly what this author is saying, and it correlates with what people were saying when they were digging up mummies and all kinds of amazing Egyptian-styled artifacts and hieroglyphics and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, um, and I want to hop into river names. We're not going to read this entire article. I've covered this before, but I just feel it's an important thing to kind of um, reestablish, as we were just talking about um, the dating. We can also kind of relate the names and why that is important, because so much of what we discuss is about language and how language is an incredible um, kind of litmus test for not only time frames, although that could be a little wishy-washy. I like the geological stuff as presented here. Again, we're not trying to pinpoint things down to a specific year or decade. We're simply showing that um, what we've been told is so far. I mean, hundreds of, you know, so far from the real case here. And the Mississippi has been running its course, although it's changed quite drastically several times due to several different events. Has been running its general course for, I don't want to go 150,000 years, but for a very long time. And um, the visual I wanted to present to you guys of, part of what I loved so much there too is just the lumberman, the Louisiana or the Kentucky axeman. Imagine that, letter, you know, hey, we're gonna need like every every feller you can ship um down here because we got an issue, and they show up and they're just chopping and chopping and chopping, 100-foot trees going down. How many? This is just mind blowing to me. And as we get farther up the Mississippi, we're going to show as they were building some more advanced construction, they were breaking their ways into tombs. And yeah, it gets crazy. The farther up the Mississippi we go, it gets pretty remarkable. But yeah, so really quick, we're going to hop into our Indian River Names, 1891. Curious identity with Old World nomenclature. The great majority of old Aboriginal names of America appear the prototype, if not the real, right? The origin. So the origin of river names, possibly from America. I apologize for the low quality. Sometimes, when you're clipping these newspapers, it's just a crapshoot. Sometimes they're perfectly legible. Other times they're quite horrible. I'm just going to go over what I've highlighted. Um, I'll um, I'll have a little link for most of these articles in the description if you want to go back and read them yourselves. Okay. The great majority of the old Aboriginal names of America have what appears to be the prototype, if not the real congener, sorry, existing in many of the ancient languages of the Old World, and even among the names of the recently discovered races of Central Africa. There are numerous analogies and identities with our native Indian appellations. In fact, the river names show so many analogies with the appellations of the Old World that they confirm the belief in the minds best informed on the subject that the American prehistoric man himself sprang from the Old World races. Now, remember what we just stated in that article and kind of the groundwork I've been laying through the entire series now, over 10 episodes, is that um, not only are some of the oldest um, petroglyphs, hieroglyphics, and oldest representations of language that exist anywhere are here in the American Southwest, and I think they connect here. So, as he stated, he's kind of going over his own words here. He's saying that it seems likely that America was not only the prototype, but the real basis for all of the river names, right? And it is the belief in the minds of the best informed on the subject that prehistoric man himself sprang from the old world races. Yeah, this was the root or the foundation, perhaps, of the old world races. At least a jumping off point. And I don't. This isn't a dick measuring contest for time and who came first or anything at all like that. I'm just trying to show a different perspective, and it's not about first or last or anything like that. I'm just want to show that there is a ancient root here in the Americas that is buried so far below our feet that it's either been purposely hidden, which obviously seems very likely at this point, um, or it's been buried so far that we have no idea of its existence, and that almost all the major cities from Alaska to where we are here in Mississippi lie on the shoulders of ancient cities and ancient races. Okay, he appears to be a mongrel, the result of a crossing of the white Europeans and the black Moorish races, for he is not the Mongolian of the East. So, very interesting because we have a lot of this here when you look into some of the early Aboriginal, quote, Aboriginal again, because they stand on the foundations of buried civilizations themselves. Um, but it's interesting, right? Because when you look at seafaring peoples and trading peoples, and the Mississippi was chock full of them in the 1600s, 1700s. They had Hebrew speaking people. The Phoenicians, Chaldeans. That sounds crazy, right? They came way before. They'd been, no, they, Egyptian. Um, what we know of how we see the world in the 1600s, let me tell you, was insanely different than what we're told. He appears to be a mongrel, like I said, a mixing of Europeans and black Moorish races, but he is not the Mongolian of the East. Now, you're going to find all of this here, and as we go through these mounds, you're going to see a lot of this. But that was a really important touch there, because you find that the Moors had a incredible correlation with the Huguenots. Again, how these groups of people were completely reclassified, and all these people are given 1,000 names, and it just becomes way too confusing. But the Moors had a root, I wouldn't say a stranglehold, but they had been trading in up the Mississippi for hundreds of years. Um, the establishment of New Granada in the American Southwest and some of the relics and ancient cities that I had shown throughout the American Southwest have a deep um, correlation. And it gets even more interesting when you find the correlations between the Chinese, the Black Moors, and the Phoenicians, okay, and Vikings. Classifications of skin color and race, they didn't really exist like they do now. Important things to remember. The old American names tell the story of the prehistoric man's origins in terms of higher significance and truth than any other evidence now known to exist. I mean, what a statement that is, right? So I'm just gonna read that again. The old American names tell the story of the prehistoric man's origin in terms of higher significance and truth than any other evidence now known to exist. This is why language is so key. And, despite the nonsense that is the discovery of America by Columbus, when you kind of break that down for what it is, and you start looking at the correlations and obsessions with language and the kind of people that he was bringing with him and the people that were translating, it becomes very interesting. And we're going to talk more in the coming weeks. I'm going to get into the Etruscans a little more. We're going to kind of break down the Phoenician, Finnish, Etruscan correlations, and we're going to connect some dots in the Yucatan. And that's important because we're dealing with the Gulf. It's the same. It's the same seafaring peoples that you're going to find in the Mississippi in this era are existing and trading with the Vikings and the Phoenicians and all of these things. And the language is a huge bridge to this, and that's exactly what this article is saying, essentially, right? That the old American names are the most um, important evidence now known to exist. The old world peoples of antiquity built their river nomenclature from brief. I apologize for the quality of monosyllabic germs of the prehistoric speech. The great bulk of the nomenclature of the New World appears to have been constructed upon the models known to exist in the ancient civilization of the East. It's, who it came before. He keeps stating this, but he's kind of tiptoeing around the fact he's saying, but the nomenclature is essentially started here, okay, and ventured the other direction. And out of the identical germ word employed by the prehistoric races of the older world, even the very words and names of the ancients are reproduced in the nomenclature of America in great frequency, whether purposefully or by chance. Well, it's definitely not by chance. As we've said many times, many words from the oldest languages known, Hebrew and Chinese, are found in our ancient Indian appellations. Now, this is exactly what I was saying. There are Morris, quote, Phoenician ships found in Oregon, Phoenician ships found below ground in caves in Colorado. Um, Not only were they called Moorish, right? Moorish slippers are oddly Phoenician, which have a lot of interesting correlations with Viking ships. And the language carved on the side of this quote Phoenician Moorish boat found in a cave below ground in Colorado was Chinese. And as we get more into the Yucatan and Mexico stuff, um, that's a bit on the back burner just because it's hard to I can't work that into Anomalous America, and I've got so many other things going. But we're going to find that some of the oldest pyramids in Mexico were covered in Chinese hieroglyphics. And why do I say hieroglyphics? Well, because the Chinese language we have today is not what the Chinese language was in the 1700s, 1600s. It was changed in the 1800s, and it just became this mashup. Okay, so many words from the oldest languages known, Hebrew and Chinese, are found in our ancient Indian appellations. Yuba is the Hebrew term for water. We have the rivers named Yuba in California, and in South America, a river and a lake that have the name written Yubul. France has the river Ube, and Africa has the Ubai. The Russian Empire has the river Ubal or Ob. Yor or Yar is a word for river in Hebrew, and in Russia, also Yar, Yer, and Yor are the river names. I'll stop there just for the sake of